Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of Ushanka Show. Stories about life in the Soviet Union. Здравствуйте, дорогие товарищи! В эфире программа Ushanka Show. Recently I made a video about Russification and shared my recollection of growing up in the Russian-speaking Ukraine during 1970s and 1980s. At the time of this recording, that video got over 300 comments, so today I would like to answer some of your questions, make some corrections, and add some more information that I forgot to mention. First of all, I need to mention that it never bothered me growing up as a Russian-speaking Ukrainian, probably because my parents were apolitical, I think that's the word. So we never discussed at home the situation why Ukrainians have to speak Russian, why everyone in the capital of Ukraine speaks Russian, all the signage, or most of it was in Russian. Although we had some Ukrainian signage, we had Ukrainian language TV station and radio stations, but generally, like Kyiv as the capital of Ukraine was Russian-speaking capital. So at home we spoke Russian. I spoke Russian at school. My parents spoke Russian at work. So that was just the way it was. I never heard my parents speaking Ukrainian between each other. And the only time I saw my mother switch into Ukrainian would be when we visit her parents in northern Ukraine. Although in northern Ukraine they don't speak exactly Ukrainian. There's like a bizarre mixture of Russian, Ukrainian, and Belarusian. It's like their own Polessia talk that has a lot of words that don't belong to Ukrainian language, but I heard them a lot there. And a couple of times when I went with my dad to his village located in Zhytomyr region, that's where they spoke Ukrainian, but it was heavy Surzhyk, so there was a lot of Russian words used in their Ukrainian, and they called me there Serozha. Man, that pissed me off so much. Instead of Seryoja, it was Serozha. Oh my god, I hated it. In school, I learned how to write and read in Russian, and only in the 4th grade, when I was 11, that's when we started having lessons of Ukrainian language and Ukrainian literature. So all the subjects, math, physics, whatever, were taught in Russian. Then we had, of course, Russian language, Russian literature, and separately Ukrainian language and Ukrainian literature. But some guys in my class didn't have to study Ukrainian language, like these two dudes next to me, Valera on the right and Alex on the left. They were from the Russian military families that came to Kyiv. So their fathers were officers that served in Kyiv. And because of that, they had the right to refuse to learn Ukrainian language. Kind of interesting. Just parents had to sign a special waiver, заявление. So they still had to sit in class. They just didn't have to study Ukrainian language and literature. And this photo was actually taken during our Ukrainian literature class. It's our Ukrainian language teacher, the only person in school that spoke Ukrainian. And she was mean, no one liked her. And to be honest, I sometimes was wondering how great it would be to have a waiver myself and not to study Ukrainian language and literature, because it was a lot of additional work, homework. You periodically need to memorize poems in Ukrainian. So that added a lot of extra work for normal Ukrainians, while those Russian guys could just hang out. So as you see, I was a bad Ukrainian, not a Ukrainian nationalist whatsoever. And remember this graph of the Russian language in orange slowly taking over Ukrainian language in blue in Ukrainian schools between 1950 and 1991. So I wouldn't be surprised if the Soviet government was planning the next step in the Russification of Ukraine is to allow anybody, not just Russian military families, to get a waiver and not to study Ukrainian language if their parents don't want to. But the Soviet Union collapsed in the end of 1991, and in following 20 years, at least in Ukraine, Ukrainian language returned back to schools. I also need to mention there was never a reason for me to become a Ukrainian nationalist or become aware of my Ukrainian nationality, because none of my Russian friends, and I had about 50-50 between Russians and Ukrainians among my friends, none of them ever made fun of me when I spoke Ukrainian. None of them ever made fun of my Ukrainian, we'll call it Southern Russian accent, Южно-российский говор. But in reality, they also spoke with the same Southern accent, although they came from Russia. It doesn't take long while you settle down in a specific area that your speech will change and you will start talking with the local accent. There was only one time that I recall, I believe I described it in my old video, Relations between Russians and Ukrainians in 1980s, when I felt kind of offended how the one Russian person was kind of looking at Ukrainian girls. One of my classmates who was Russian, he was having a wedding, I believe it was summer of 1990. So he invited a lot of relatives from Russia, from Murom region, and there was one guy, his cousin, who came, and he was in his early 20s, and he was determined to have sex with a Ukrainian girl, but he used the derogatory term "chachlushka" while he was partying here in Kiev. And he didn't want to just get laid. He specifically was looking for an Ukrainian girl to screw. So, and that was the very first time I experienced kind of this attitude towards other nationalities. Like, who cares what nationality the girl? If she's pretty and you get lucky, fine. But he wanted specifically a Ukrainian girl back then. And now let's take a look at some of your comments. And by the way, thank you so much for participation in this conversation. I think it's very important. Okay, here we go. I think you've made a mistake here. I've never heard Russians saying "что." They usually say "что." But Ukrainians say "sho." You are absolutely correct. I had, like Americans like to say, a brain fart, and I made a mistake. So when we say "what" in Russian, it's "что." It's spelled "to," but people say "что." But Ukrainians say "sho," and it's just like we say it in Ukrainian as well as in Russian. So this is kind of like a Southern Russian accent. If people, instead of "what," they say "sho," they're from or Ukraine or like Krasnodar region, Southern Russia. And speaking of Southern Russian accent, we also need to mention frikativny zvuk G. So it's like a fricative sound of G. So we don't say G, we say more like H, and that's another kind of sign that person is from Ukraine or from the Krasnodar region. And by the way, just recently I've discovered that modern Ukrainian alphabet has two letters G. So we have a fricative G, H, and looks like Russian G, and the Ukrainian explosive G. That one is supposed to sound like G, while normal G sounds more like H. And I know it sounds super confusing, but I noticed this change actually in my first name, Sergey. So in Russian, my name sounds Sergey, and in Ukrainian, it's Sergey. So when I came to America for the very first time back in 1995, I still carried Soviet-era passport. So my name was Russian-style Sergey, spelled in French way, Serguei. Quite awkward. Sergey. When that passport expired in 1997, I got brand new Ukrainian passport for traveling abroad, and there my name was spelled Ukrainian way, Sergey, but it was spelled Sergiy. So everyone was reading Sergey, and I really didn't like it. So all my life I was Sergey. But of course, when I came to America, I discovered that being a Sergey is not really cool first name, especially among the American kids. So that's when I came up with CJ. So that's how I used as my first name in the summer camp. And I didn't like that spelling and confusion with Sergey. So when I finally got my American citizenship, I changed back to Sergey, Sergei. By the way, I still use CJ quite often, especially when I order food. When people asking what's the name for your order, I'll just say CJ, and I don't need to spell my name. Very, very convenient. But as I mentioned earlier, my Ukrainian spelling was Sergiy. But I noticed recently people spell their name Serhii, and I think it's like really bad inconvenient spelling. But this is the modern style now to spell Sergey. And speaking of Southern Russian accents and its effect on Russian people, our teacher Russian language, Elvira Sergeyevna, she was originally from Ural Mountains, and she complained to us one time that she has to go back every year for at least 2 months or so back to Urals to restore her proper Russian language, because spending the time with us in Kiev made her say "sho" and have a Southern Russian accent. Another comment from John Defen. I saw Russification in action in Estonia during the 70s. Large areas were colonized by constructing large industrial plants with housing and providing Russian colonists with subsidies to serve as labor. On a smaller scale, retail jobs in Tallinn, which is the capital of Estonia, most often went to Russians. You could not buy a loaf of bread in Estonian, so while you ask in Estonian language, in Estonian's own capital city. This is a very interesting subject, is Russification through constructing large industrial factories in places that maybe not economically making sense, but it makes sense for adding Russian people into local population. And I discovered similar situation in Kyrgyzstan. A couple of years ago, we hosted 2 exchange units. One was from France and another one from Kyrgyzstan. And during the conversation, I learned that they used to have a large agriculture equipment factory in Bishkek. Well, at that time, Bishkek was called Frunze, and it was the capital of Kyrgyzstan. And a factory was named after Frunze as well. If you look at the map, Kyrgyzstan is the mountains country. It's pretty much all it is just mountains. So it really didn't make any sense, in my opinion, to place a large agriculture equipment factory far away from agricultural lands, like in Ukraine or southern Russia, Belarus, and so on. One of their main products was straw and hay balers. In 1970, that factory manufactured 15,000 of hay balers, and they sold them all over the Soviet Union, as well as Bulgaria, India, and Hungary. Now, if you look at the map, the distance between Bishkek and Kyiv, it's about 2.5 thousand miles. So it's picture you have a factory located in Juneau, Alaska, and you ship your balers down to Bismarck, North Dakota. This kind of the distances we're talking about. Super expensive, super makes no sense. So it's no surprise that after the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, that factory went out of business in no time. I don't know about how good the equipment was, how modern it was, but just shipping itself made them completely not competitive. And there's another fun fact for you about Russification and Sovietization of Kyrgyzstan. During the Soviet days, the capital of Kyrgyzstan, Frunze, had 80% of people that came from the European part of the USSR, so Russians, Ukrainians, and so on, and only 12% were Kyrgyz. Now it's 75% Kyrgyz in Bishkek. So it definitely appears that the main reason the factories were built in the capital of Kyrgyzstan during the Soviet days was to bring more Russian-speaking population, and that way to work on Russification and Sovietization of Kyrgyz Soviet Socialist Republic. Otherwise, that straw baler factory should be located somewhere in Ukraine or southern Russia, just like the main factory of John Deere is located in Illinois, not Alaska. Alright, so another comment. Russification took many forms and shapes. Another form was the forced migration of Russians into various regions of Imperial Russia and the Soviet Union. Additionally, people from those regions were forced to migrate to the most remote parts of Russia proper. This is one of the biggest reasons why there are many Russian minority communities to the Eastern Europe and Balkans. I have really nothing to add here, because yes, the Russian Crimea was always Tatars' Crimea until in 1944 Stalin forcefully removed all the Crimean Tatars into Kazakhstan and Siberia, and then Russians came and replaced them. And speaking of migration, or more like moving within the Soviet Union, it was extremely hard. Government controlled movement of people in the country through the Propiska system, and I already have the video on this topic. I'll post the link below in the comment section. So you literally had to be assigned, have a permission to live in Kyiv or Moscow or any other town. There was an ink stamp in your passport, and when you want to move, first you need to get permission from the other location that they will let you be assigned there. So that was a pain in the butt. So people couldn't move freely, and that was another way of controlling where the population would go. Another comment. A good translation of Surzhyk to English could be Creole, and the mix of English and Spanish has the term Spanglish. Here's an interesting comment. Recently NATO, the Ukrainian government tried to do that in eastern Ukraine with Ukrainian language, and that didn't turn out well, haha. Would you believe that this guy is subscribed to my channel for 3 years now? And he writes comments like this. So I was like, why even bother to watch my channel? Anyway, so if people believe that it was NATO behind the Ukrainian government trying to reintroduce Ukrainian language in eastern Ukraine, that's like the dumbest thing I ever heard. And actually, it's one of the popular Kremlin's talking points that the law of 2014, so after Yanukovych ran away, that the new law about Ukrainian language banned Russian language. It did not. People still can talk Russian, It's just if you want to be in Ukrainian government, you must speak Ukrainian, you must do your paperwork in Ukrainian language, which is really bizarre to be Ukrainian official but doing paperwork in Russian. Schools should be teaching subjects in Ukrainian, in Ukraine, and many other things. No one banned Russian language. You can still talk on the streets, in your family, do whatever, but schools, universities, being in government, Ukrainian language is the state language. Which brings me to this comment. Why are you an Ukrainian speaking English? I don't know, because I live in the United States and that's what they speak here, English. And why there are areas in Ukraine today that actually forbid Russian language in schools, which never happened with Ukrainian language under USSR. And here's the classic example. A person cannot understand how is it possible that Ukrainian is speaking English. I live in an English-speaking country, so I'm speaking English. And if you are Russian living in Ukraine, you probably should speak Ukrainian. Duh. And his statement about that Ukrainian language was never banned in the Soviet Union, it did happen in Krasnodar region. There's a lot of Ukrainians there, and they used to have Ukrainian schools and Ukrainian churches even during the Tsar time when the Cossacks moved down there. But under Stalin in 1932, all the Ukrainian schools were switched to Russian, and they also banned Ukrainian language in churches. And now there's hardly anyone there speaks Ukrainian, because it takes about 3 generations for the language to disappear. And before we wrap up this video, I just want to say something else about languages. I believe that one day, in a distant future, there will be only one language in the world. It's probably going to be English. It's just the final result of globalization. We're going to be one big nation, just people of planet Earth. We're going to speak one language. People maybe will be, bilingual or trilingual. They'll still remain their original languages if they want to. But it's going to happen natural way, just how it's, happening right now slowly. Like when I had exchange students, the guy from France, Simon, he learned English on his own with YouTube. He never learned it in school, but he was fluent, really fluent in English. Okay, so I think we kind of covered the topic of Russification and using Russian language as a tool to make Soviet people. I hope you enjoyed the story. As always, please don't forget to subscribe if you watched all the video, you like it. Also, don't forget to like it, post your comment, and we'll talk to you soon. До свидания. Goodbye.